Hi, my name is Ashton, and I will be talking about public education inequality in the United States, a little bit about how it works and what we can do to try and solve it. So there are a few different aspects to this problem that we have here. Firstly, we might be underfunding schools to an extent. Maybe if we provided more funding in poor districts, we'd see a positive difference. Secondly, we're going to cover some of the socioeconomic bits. Um, And thirdly, we'll take a look at how we can more equitably fund schools. And then lastly, we'll analyze how much money schools really need and what parts of a school are most important to fund. My claim is that our education system is unequal across the United States, and many scholars will agree that the foundation of a society is its education. Um, so a quick breakdown, real quick, of how of the most common model for how school funding works. Um, public schools funding or their revenue sources can be categorized in three different ways: federal, state, and local funding. The most common model for funding schools is called the foundation grant model, and under this model, the state decides the minimum amount of money that should be spent per student, then calculates each district's ability to pay that amount, and then it'll fill in that gap or any gaps that they may have with funding. So for example, if a state decides that funding per student must total at least $10,000, local funding will do their best to meet that amount, and it typically comes from property taxes. If a district cannot meet $10,000 per student, if it can't meet that demand, then the state will fill that gap, and that usually comes from sales and or income taxes, depending on the state. However, one of the issues with this model of funding is that if a district can raise more than $10,000 per student, then that district will have more resources per student than a district that cannot raise more than $10,000 per student, and then had to receive state funding to fill the gap because $10,000 is all they get. Depending on what the local property values and the tax revenue are, a more affluent city or district could be able to spend more money on its students than poorer cities or districts can on their students. This can happen within the same state and even in the same counties. In addition to that, the funding becomes even more unequal if one state decides that each student's education is worth only $10,000, and then another state with a similar economy decides that each student's education is worth only $6,000 or $7,000. So now we're going to take a look at how social or economic class might play a role in the quality of education that someone receives. So some good things right here off the bat are that school readiness has increased over time. And this is because of an increase in more parental care early in childhood and higher enrollment in preschool education. And between the years of 1998 and 2010, gaps between higher funded students and lower funded ones shrank by 10% in math and 16% in reading scores for low income students, while we saw a 15% overall decrease in the gap between white students and black students and white students to Hispanic students. This is all great, but actually at this rate, the gap would take another 60 to 110 years to fully close, which is not so good. Even if the gaps were closed at the start of education, like kindergarten, that wouldn't guarantee that over the course of the 12 grades, an underprivileged student would learn the same amount as a privileged one. The effects of this school readiness do not persist for long either. We tend to see that the students who are persistently disadvantaged, or in other words, those who have been eligible for things like free or reduced lunch since kindergarten, are the ones who will see a drop-off in the effects of early education supplements like preschool after the third grade. This means that after third grade, education disparities will either grow or just not shrink anymore, which is also not good. So an idea that I've come up with to solve this issue of schools having unequal and what seems to be inadequate funding sometimes is to pool federal, state, and local tax dollars, the ones that would be used for schools regularly. Then, while accounting for local economies and following um, adequacy studies find how much a school would need to provide an adequate education to its students. The Department of Education most likely the Department of Education, would distribute these funds proportionally and equally among each school district to provide every student across the nation with a perfectly consistent quality of education. This idea would work best when states and local economies work cooperatively and provide the most funding they can each time the yearly budget is determined or constructed. As a result, I believe that the quality of education of the vast majority of students in the nation would increase, and also increase with relevant tax rates, if the funding is used adequately and appropriately. So let's challenge that idea. Does throwing money at schools make them better? Not necessarily. The Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development believes that after the amount of $3,500 per year per student, excess funding will have no effect on a student's performance academically. For example, they also say that countries with a higher cumulative expenditure on education, like Luxembourg, Norway, Switzerland, and the United States, all show similar levels of performance as countries that spend half that much per student, such as Estonia, Hungary, and Poland. But when we take a closer look at how the money is spent, rather than how much, we notice from data by the Program for International Student Assessment that things like higher investment in high-quality educators directly increase the quality of education, and it increases with higher educators even more than it does with reducing class sizes. Another study done in almost 900 schools in Texas by Ronald Ferguson in 1991 found that higher spending on instructional equipment and also higher quality educators also had a strong positive influence on students' test scores. If the inputs of funding schools were teachers and instructional equipment, the outputs would be higher test scores and increased graduation rates. Adequacy studies, like I mentioned earlier, can be conducted to find an adequate amount of funding that a student or that a school might need to spend in order to provide an adequate level of education to each student. So obviously our education system is inadequate in big ways, and if these cracks in our foundation keep expanding, who knows what'll happen, you know? We really need to continue pushing for more adequately funded schools, and we need to remember to hold our district administrators responsible when spending our tax dollars, to spend them on the right things. It's no child's fault that they are poor, and it's no child's fault that their district does not have the proper funding. So whose fault is it if they fail? It's ours. We need to do better. Here are my sources, and thank you for watching.